Hello, guys. Thank you for coming onto my show and letting me learn how to do a group chat by myself without my husband's help. So,
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us, Andrea.
okay, so
It's happy to be here.
yes, so let me introduce my two guests. Up in my left quadrant, we have Mr. Ryan Bennett, who is the author of IDW Protocol. What is that? You'll find out. And then up in my right quadrant, I have a Mr. or Pastor Paul Vanderclay. And you actually, this is your third time on my show, and you're the first third. So you win. Yay.
I win!
So I guess I didn't really give you much of an intro though, Paul. I'm just like, he's the pastor, and he's been on my show 3 times.
I'm the pastor who's been on our show 3 times.
it's-
I live in Sacramento,
He's got the hat
California.
trick.
Yeah.
I have the hat trick. That's
Yes.
right. Canadians should know what that means.
Yeah, barely. I grew up in a house of women, and we didn't do sports, but I do know that it's a hockey thing. Yeah. Okay, now everyone's gonna hate me. Yes, it's a hockey thing. Okay, so Paul, you're from Sacramento, and where are you right now, Ryan?
I'm in Denver, Colorado.
Okay. So the reason why it is the 3 of us talking is because, well, I'm the common denominator between the 2 of you.
Yeah.
And we've been talking, Paul, the last I spoke with you was on this estuary concept, which we'll get into. And Ryan, you were one of the first interviews I did, one of the early, I think maybe within 5 or 6 interviews. We talked about the IDW protocol way back when the IDW was still in full force.
Yeah, what was that, the end of 2017 or 18?
18, I think, yes.
18.
So, and we're doing similar things here. So I'm trying to think. I think that maybe okay, Paul, can you frame the situation? Because when Ryan was asking for a bit of a summary on where you're at, you started off with modernity has been waning for the past 100 years.
Yeah, I thought I'd pull back and start with something small, like all of modernity. Well, I wanted to talk to Ryan, and I noticed that Andrea had already made the connection, but it got lost in my Twitter mess. So I found it. I said, oh, I want to talk to Ryan, because I, of course, got very interested in Jordan Peterson. And after Jordan Peterson arose, then Eric Weinstein coined this term, the IDW. And okay, so intellectual dark web, and I didn't know much about the dark web or anything. And then I heard about this Ryan Bennett guy who had this idea about the IDW protocol. And the thing that stuck in my head was, it's about the network, not what's on the hard drives. And I thought, yeah, that's right. And David Fuller mentioned it a couple of times. David Fuller brought it up a few times. And then, of course, Andrea apparently had sent me an email early on that I had responded to, but then had forgotten who she was. And then I heard, well, he had been on Andrea's show. And so one thing led to another. I thought, no, I want to talk to Ryan, because I'd like to find out what his thoughts are now, because that was a while ago that he made this observation. David Fuller was on Andrea's channel, and I thought that was an excellent conversation between you and David Fuller. And I thought you really pushed David to dig a little bit deeper into the IDW stuff. And David Fuller, a couple of months ago, had done a college lecture or something on the IDW, which I thought was also very helpful. And so part of the reason I got into this was I'm an inveterate digger. When I hear something that's interesting to me, it's like I'm just not happy with just Ryan's idea. I want to know what's behind Ryan's idea and where he's coming from, because I think David Fuller is correct that the IDW has sort of receded, and I think it in many ways receded because of Jordan Peterson's absence. And I think that has to do for a number of reasons, But I think that, and again, I started this conversation with a bigger frame that it's my thesis that modernity, well, these things are very long-lived things. And so modernity has been dying for over 100 years, but we're getting to a point in our culture
Can
where...
Can you explain what you mean by modernity has been dying for over 100 years? We can't just go. I'm like, I've got to stop him because we can't just glaze past that.
Yeah, the modernity is sort of the idea that human beings can disembody themselves from their context, the world as such, and control it as such. I think modernity is a sort of self-forgetfulness, and again, Jonathan Pageau's term that he said on your channel. See, 100 years from now, Andrea, everyone's going to look at your channel and say, Andrea had it all on her channel. And, you know, nobody was paying attention. But there it was. Because Jonathan Pageau, as he said about a physicist, we are patterns looking at patterns. And as modernity recedes, as this imaginary process by which we imagine I'm seeing the world as it is as such, as that is receding, we are now more and more aware of the fact that I have biases, I have agendas, I have biases and agendas that I'm not even necessarily aware of. I mean, that's what's getting caught in all this postmodernity stuff. And what I saw, I think, you know, what I really saw in Ryan's observation about the IDW was that here was an attempt to create a protocol for different people making progress in, okay, modernity is dying. What are we going to do about this? What does this mean? Because aspects of modernity can't die because we are dependent upon them. As N.T. Wright said, I don't want to go to a pre-modern dentist. I don't want to go to a postmodern dentist. I want to go to a modern dentist because, you know, I want the data that's in my mouth. And many of the individuals of the IDW, Sam Harris in particular, I think the Weinsteins, very much want to stop the recession of modernity. That's their goal. And they're going to lose because they don't even appreciate all of the ways that they themselves are postmodern. And even though Jordan Peterson made a huge splash crying out against postmodern neo-Marxists and such, Peterson in many ways was able to create a conversation in which pre-moderns, moderns, and postmoderns, well, the postmoderns got a little prickly, but there's a great deal of postmodernity built into Jordan Peterson, and he understands, I think, parts of it quite well, so that actually for a moment it looked like, wow, we might have an adult productive conversation here. And then it looked like, well, maybe we can't. And so that's kind of where we're at in the United States right now. We're in the midst of a presidential election, which is the hardest time to have an adult conversation. And so I thought, I want to talk to Ryan Bennett because I want to dig into this observation and get his take on how he figured this out, because I think he's dead on right, and what his observations are now. So that's the framing of this conversation for me.
Okay. Ryan, thoughts?
Well, I'm going to try not to blush. That was very complimentary. Thank you. There's a lot there. I want to start maybe before diving right into the IDW and protocol stuff. I like this observation that the transition between modernity and postmodernity is sort of, in some ways, inevitable, or at least I've always thought that there's kind of like you can't go back to the Garden of Eden, right? Like once you can't unbite the apple, you can't unlearn the thing that you have learned, right? So you can't go back to previous, won't happen. And if you try and do something like that, you're going to have disastrous consequences politically and socially, right? Because you're going to try and artificially put the monsters back in Pandora's box, and in your effort to do something like that, you're going to wind up doing heinous things to sort of try and rewrite time or rewrite history, right? So that's the one cliff you can fall off socially and culturally and politically. And I will flag up front that given the crazy year we've been having, and especially given that it's election year in the States and things are going, it's going to be probably unavoidable that a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be colored by this cultural moment. So I won't be able to extract myself and talk fully in textbook abstractions. So that's one cliff you can fall over, and that's the failure mode of conservatism. And Jordan Peterson would always talk about this, like trying to go backwards in times is the regressive failure mode of conservatism. Mm-hmm. And then you've got the progressive failure mode, which is going way too hard in the opposite direction and trying to invent your way out of problems that you don't fully understand and create a bunch of new problems. And that's the postmodern cliff. Now I have had a alternating mental relationship with postmodernism at turns. Because to your point about the dentist, or, my favorite is always, building a bridge or building, or like modernity got us to the moon, right? That's nothing to shove off lightly, right? It accomplishes great things. And my frustration with postmodern thinking has always been that it's the core observation of subjectivity embedded in all things. It's sort of like, Einstein's relativity for objectivity as such, right? There's no privileged frame of reference where you can stand outside of a system and look at the entire system because you're always embedded within it. So you always have a relative speed and position relative to everything else. That's going to influence the red shift and blue shift of everything that you're observing around you. And the same is true of so many different domains. And that's fine. And I often think of postmodern epistemology as something that could, in principle, be done right. And probably is necessary to do right. It's almost like quantum physics for epistemology, right? It's like you zoom in really, really far at the ways that we generate knowledge and the ways that we think about the world, and you find that your classical intuitions, your Newtonian physics, your binary logic, your standard operating model that helps you get from point A to point B and shoot a cannon in a predictable arc, that stuff sort of starts to break down when you zoom way, way, way into the way language is used, into the way consciousness perceives events around you. It starts to break down, and there's a worthwhile study to take place there. My frustration is with I'll go back to quantum physics. My frustration with quantum physics is not a frustration with quantum physics. It's when I go into the New Age section of the bookstore and I start seeing books that use the jargon from quantum physics to justify why this pill is going to, this sugar pill is going to cure you. Why, if I hold this magic crystal above your third eye, it will relieve your anxiety and decalcify your pineal gland, right? When you get into those super nuanced fields, right, that are making within their field, they're making very specific, well thought out claims. It creates this body of jargon that charlatans will be like, ooh, this is popular right now. I'm going to take this word, I'm going to take this word, I'm going to take this word, and I'm going to make so much money selling people a lie that sounds that I'm going to be able to justify. Now, the difference in what's going on with the postmodern stuff is that I think that racket is not just being run out of the hippie bookstore. That with quantum mechanics, the people at the university studying quantum mechanics are doing the real work, and the hippie bookstore is there's some guy smoking pot in the back room, and
naturally,
waxing poetical using these terms. Now, my sense is that there are some scholars that are, and I've increasingly come across them, and this is what has led me, this has tempered my rage at postmodern thinking, is because, every once in a while I'll come across someone they're doing the thinking well,
okay.
right? And they're constraining it to the domain of its import. But 2 doors down the hallway at the very same university is another person who is completely equal in credential, but they're performing the role of the pot-smoking charlatan. So it's harder to determine without actually sitting down and looking at the actual claims. It's become very frustrating because the credential is no longer a good sorting mechanism for whether someone's doing the real work or someone's spinning the yarn, as it were. So that's, I just went off on a wild tangent about maybe 5% of what you talked about, but there's a lot there.
The modernity thing, yes, okay, so I can see the connection there, but what about, can you connect what you just said with regards to the creation of the IDW? Because that is coming out of what you're describing, about it's a bit of a reaction, and then IDW protocol? Sure,
I can give it the old college try.
Let's connect it. Let's connect the little dots.
Yeah. There's the IDW as it formed, I think, was in part a reaction to this phenomenon you're talking about, Paul, but I don't think that's the whole story. I think a lot of it is a function of the moment in time with regards to the media landscape. We're doing this chat right now for publication on YouTube. The possibility of this, it's been possible for going on a decade right now, but it's only really picked up in the last several years and become, it's a thing that, it's super common to listen to a podcast while you're working out or driving right now, whereas you kind of had to be the podcast geek 5 or 6 years ago in order for that to be a part of your life. And I think the IDW was really one of several interesting things that came out of like that growth and zeitgeist, right? You're guaranteed to get a bunch of interesting things come out of it. And I think to an extent, the IDW is one of them. Now, to the point on postmodernism, well, it's true that part of it came out of, sort of the campus craziness, quote unquote, phenomenon. And you had figures like Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson. And then you also had, say, Ben Shapiro, who, while not a professor, sort of, made a good publicity stunt out of going to campuses and pissing off a bunch of 19-year-old liberals. There was an element of that, but there's also a part of it, like with Sam Harris, who sort of came out of the new atheist movement, right? And a lot of times I think of that there's a very real way in which you could consider, if you recall, Dawkins, Bennett, Hitchens, and Sam Harris doing the Four Horsemen video from, I think it was early 2000s, I want to say. There's an element of which you could almost view them as proto-IDW, that new atheist movement, because it was much more combative. But in terms of, if the medium is the message, the way that a lot of the new atheism stuff kicked off was, public debates that got uploaded to YouTube, right? Like that's how I, as a teenager, that's how I learned who Sam Harris was, and that's how I learned who Hitchens was, and all of them. And even, sort of the tail end of that, as YouTube's algorithms got more complex, I started finding out about Steven Pinker through that same sort of avenue. And I think just it's a shame that the focus in all the commentary on the IDW has always been about the response to, off the wall progressivism. Because I think the more important project is one of how do we not lose our minds in a communications environment that is not only amenable to us losing our minds, but is actually profiting off of us losing our minds increasingly with every passing day. And that, to me, was what the core of the project was. It was like, how do we have a conversation and make sense together in an environment that might be hostile to it? Now, the hostility of the campus environment became the hostility that is the focus when everyone takes a look at it, because it's easy to see the hostility of a bunch of teenagers shouting someone down. That's very salient. But I think the more important project is the hostility of the digital realm at all, to make good sense, because the digital realm that we're increasingly, especially in 2020, we're spending all of our time in that realm through quarantine. That's the realm that we really need to figure out how to navigate, because it's the one that's creating all the other hostilities. And that was a very long-winded ramble about the formation of the IDW, but
that was really good.
No, it was good, and I want to throw it, because I do want to talk about IDW protocol, but I would like to put it over to Paul.
Toss it back to Paul.
Yes, to respond.
Oh, I really like what you said, Ryan. I really like what you said right there, and I think that is very, very true. I was just on Peter Lindbergh's Stoa, and one of the comments I made to him that struck him was that I said that I think, because the question sort of he framed the interview was, how can you be a Christian in the middle of a culture war? And I told him, I think actually a culture war is a terrific time to be a Christian, because my reading of Jesus of Nazareth was that he not only, he didn't really survive the culture war, he got crucified, but his crucifixion became, was integral to his, I would say, his resolution of the culture war. And I really, my wife, let's say I was sitting around a couple nights ago, and my wife, okay, well, let's watch something. So she picked up Netflix, and Netflix has a documentary on social media and some of these issues. And I was kind of watching it while I was doing something else. But I think your point here of, how do we not lose our minds in a communication environment where it's profitable, where people are profiting from us losing our minds. And when I peruse YouTube, for example, at least within the corner of the conversations that I'm most interested in, I often note the rapid rise of individuals who are basically dispensing red meat to their political or religious base. And just even with the little bit of uplift I got from making commentary videos on Jordan Peterson, I felt enough of that lift and the economic incentives, the possibilities, the temptations inherent in all of that to feel its power, but also, at least within my own Christian frame and language, the seductions of the dark side, let's say. And now, fortunately for me, I experienced this in my mid-50s. If I had experienced this in my teens or 20s, I wouldn't want my children becoming YouTube celebrities. Because I think it could ruin their lives. And I think you're exactly right that the current communication context that we're in is in many ways primed to destroy the conversation and perhaps even the social fabric that we're in. And I think actually, so right now my own denomination is probably about to descend into a bitter war that might bring the denomination's demise, at least a denomination as I've known it. And this has been happening in churches all across the board. And part of what's actually quite convenient for the overall culture to have churches descending into these civil wars is that churches actually have a lot of built up wisdom and documented experience in dealing with conflicts that are extrapolated into the infinite. And even so, churches tend to do fairly poorly at it. But I deeply appreciate what you said, and also the observation that, because I think what you did is you deeply tied the medium, which has been podcasts, long form YouTube, into this, and I think you're very much right.
Yeah. There's I was unaware that what denomination is yours?
Christian Reformed Church of North America.
Okay. Unfortunately, I know less than nothing about that. So you'll have to forgive my ignorance there.
I'm fussing with my camera right now because I see the battery meter that it's dying. So
oh no!
You keep talking and I'll fuss.
Sure.
Andrea got a chance to fix her stuff when we started. Now I need to fix.
Oh, mine. I've had visual problems quietly dealing with them. The audience knows. Sorry, gotcha. Ryan, go on.
No, it's fine. So it's riffing on the sort of medium, the importance of the medium, right? Everyone likes to bandy about that the internet is it's an innovation in communication on the scale of the Gutenberg printing press, right? That's a very fashionable and almost boring thing to say. Mm-hmm. The problem is no one goes one step further into the analysis and say, okay, well, what happened after the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, right?
Was the Reformation? Oh, I love it, and I want to hear Paul's. Oh no, signal! Shoot.
I'm still here.
Okay.
Oh my! I gotta hear Paul's reaction to this.
So how many years of bloodshed was there right after the Gutenberg printing press?
Oh, Ryan, that's so perfect. Like what? Why haven't we gone there?
Yeah, and what we remember is the formation of the Invisible College and the Republic of Letters and the eventual invention of first scientific journals and the Enlightenment. And that's all well and good, but I'm pretty sure it took us like 150, 200 years to like get to the other side of that fully.
You're right.
So my hope actually with the IDW was actually that it is like technology makes the inevitable happen faster, right? So you have compounding returns. So imagine the Reformation squunched up into a much shorter time span. Now that's terrifying, but it also means that we might get. Could you imagine if we're on our way? If the question is, can we survive this moment? And on the other side of it, we're going to have like, okay, we've created this new communication medium. Everybody's losing their mind. You have a period of intense strife. But on the other side of it, you have an Enlightenment scale period, right? And you know, the internet gets created, you get 4chans, you get trolls, you get cat memes, you get social media craziness, and you nearly tear yourselves apart because of it. But at the end of it, once you become mature enough as a species to deal with this new tool at your disposal and be able to make use of this giant scaled communication medium, what do you get at the other side? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure whether this is apocrypha or not, but there's this notion of the invisible college.
Yes. I remember you went over this in our,
Oh, yeah. So the invisible college is, these natural philosophers sending each other letters and sending each other, like, prototyping experiments with each other. And it was sort of the prototype of scientific journals and coming up with peer review and the scientific method and the prototype of the Royal Society and its publications, right? So in one framing, I sort of viewed, or I hoped that the IDW would be that sort of, I thought, oh, here's that first little prototype of what we might get on the other side of the insanity of social media. We've got those first little people that are like, I'm way over here, you're way over there, you're way over there, but we're going to tease out a way that I can take this idea in my mind and thread the needle, send you this little paper airplane through the inferno and have it make it all the way to the other side. Yeah. In a way that the environment, currently isn't hospitable to. Now, we can talk about what's happened with the IDW in the last couple of years. Or, we can talk about, I always try and steer this conversation when it gets brought up. I'm less interested in talking about, like, oh, whatever happened to Dave Rubin? He's doing weird stuff now. Or, like, where Jordan Peterson got, like, those discussions, they have, I think, a limited worth, because it's always worth it to do a retrospective. But quite frankly, I think they've been done to death. And I'm always more interested in, okay, if that was version 0.1, what's version 0.2? Because that's the more interesting project to me.
That's where this Estuary comes in, I think, because it reminded me, and I think also it reminds Paul, and I'm going to let you talk in a moment, Paul, just so I'm going to do a little sum up, because the IDW protocol is not around a group of people. It was maybe modeled with these original people, but it's supposed to be this idea of people having civil conversations because they want to know, not because they're trying to get the other person to their side. They just want to know. They want to know, okay, well, what do you think then? Let's talk. And I think that the Paul's Estuary idea kind of reminds me of that. So with that said, Paul, take it away.
Well, so a couple months back, so I'm a minister in a denomination that is a Protestant denomination with reformational roots, and part of what that, with intentional reformational roots, and part of what that means is that a certain amount of DNA and practice goes back to that Reformation period. Part of what happened, there's so much here. Part of what happened, so Martin Luther, let me first say, none of us ever know exactly what we're doing. I think that much has become clear to me. So Martin Luther.
How very postmodern of you.
Yes. Martin Luther sparks this thing, and his protector, was an ardently religious individual. Wittenberg had one of the best collection of relics in the Holy Roman Empire, and the Luther's protector Frederick the Wise was trying to establish for himself sort of a real epicenter of, is really trying to establish a religious hotbed. And so he recruited Martin Luther, who was a brilliant young Augustinian monk who was terribly earnest and terribly zealous and passionate and articulate and all of those things. Luther, of course, is seething by many of the issues that had been around for a very long time in the Holy Roman Empire. And, so his 95 Theses, which he posted in Latin on the door of the Wittenberg church, and Wittenberg was both a church and a university, he posted his theses in Latin in order to spark academic discussion amongst his colleagues. That's what Luther did. Some of Luther's students then take the 95 Theses, translate it into German, get it printed up as a pamphlet, and off it goes. And because of that, suddenly the powers that be in the Roman Catholic Church know that they have a religious political problem on their hands that needs to be addressed. 100 years before, Jan Hus in Saxony had made some very similar points, and basically the machinery of the Roman Catholic Church had him burned at the stake. The same machinery...
As you do.
What's that?
As you do.
Right. That's right. The same machinery was turning in Luther's case, but Frederick says, gosh, I've got all this investment in young Martin, and he's stirring the pot. And, even though this is a man who had invested heavily in relics, and of course, where Luther's going to take this thing is going to destroy the relic market in Wittenberg. And so off this thing goes. But the political, economic, theological, technological context, even that 100 years separating Jan Hus from Martin Luther, is significantly different. That basically he kidnaps Luther, locks him up in a castle. Luther isn't really liking it, but, his protector is protecting him. And so, and he translates the Bible into German. He writes these treatises, and the more people push against Luther in that way is sort of like a Jordan Peterson figure, because the more people would push against Luther's just wanting to have an academic debate. And then the church starts to lean into him, and he digs in, and he bites back, and the church bites back, and this whole context just goes crazy. And, within, for the next couple hundred years, Europe is going to be in flames. And the lines won't always be clear in terms of, in the messiness of post-Reformation battlefield. You're going to have Protestants and Catholics sometimes aligning and sometimes fighting each other. You've got the rise of nation states. You've got France and Spain and eventually England. And you've got Henry VIII initially being very much against the Reformation until he's got this wife problem, and now he's for it. And I mean, and it just causes this tremendous mess.
Therefore,
never write in Latin.
Never write. Always post your latest hot takes on the internet, especially YouTube and Twitter, where you can grab a flash mob. So now, years later, a guy like, I don't know if you know who C.S. Lewis is. He was he was an Oxford scholar.
I only know Lewis from the book series.
Yeah. Lewis, when asked about the Reformation, basically got a sour look on his face and said, the issues of the Reformation should have been handled, and this is, of course, an Oxford scholar, behind closed doors with ample, with lots of pipe smoking and it should have happened in taverns amongst good friends, talking about Aquinas and Aristotle and working through all of these issues. But instead, Europe processed it with bloody war after war and one thing after another. Mm-hmm. My bid in Estuary is after living most of my career as a local pastor, watching fights of all kinds over what women can do and what women can't do. What about the gays? What about how we take the Lord's Supper? What music should we play in church and what shouldn't we? What should the liturgy be? On and on and on and on. And also watching the political battles take place. Part of me watches these battles and says, you know, there are better ways for us to talk about these things. And I think we can do it. So why don't we try? And obviously, as a Christian minister, and as a Christian minister sort of on the conservative end of things, who believes in God and the resurrection and the second coming and the inspiration of Scripture, all of these things that in certain camps are very out of fashion, but in other camps are, you know, basically table stakes for having a legitimate conversation. I seem to be able to talk to both sides.
I wouldn't consider you conservative. But that's just...
There are people to the right of me and people to the left of me. I'm in the middle in a lot of different ways. And I think we need to have a conversation. And then Jordan Peterson comes along, and I'm listening to him talk about the Bible, and I'm thinking, boy, he's got some really fresh takes on some stuff in the Bible that I'm really finding stimulating. And I'm watching lots of other people get stimulated by it. And I'm watching people who are sort of over in the Sam Harris camp suddenly get interested about the Bible. And I'm watching deeply religious people sort of talking to those people. And I'm like, hey, something really cool is happening here. Why? And so I make a video and people start watching it. And people start talking to me. And some of them are atheists, and so they're all over the map. And so then people are like, well, why don't we start a meetup at church? And we can talk. And so, okay, I don't know that anybody will come. And so I go on to meetup.com and I type Jordan Peterson Meetup Sacramento. And I think, is anybody going to come to this? I don't know. But what, $90, which is a ripoff for my meetup for 6 months, but a lot cheaper than a lot of the silly church outreach things we do. And, you know, a dozen people show up. And we want to talk about God or no God. And, you know, the Donald Trump is about the only thing we can't say in the room, because then, of course, everything goes weird. But he who must not be named. But other than that, for the most part, you know, we're having adult conversations in this space. And as a Christian minister who's got a calling and a bent for evangelism, it's like, you know, I could go weeks and months and even years without having these kinds of conversations with people all over the spectrum, politically, religiously, and it's just happening now. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah,
I wonder how much more of this we can do. And then Estuary was the idea that came out of my head in terms of I wanted kind of a poetic visual image of what I think needs to happen, and Estuary was it.
Can you? I know I'm missing context here. What's the etymology of just that word, estuary?
No, Paul.
Well, so you know, I watch, you know, the rise of Jonathan Pageau in this, I think, has also been noteworthy, because Jonathan Pageau grew up evangelical, was a missionary in Africa, also an artist, and so he becomes this Orthodox icon carver. And if there's anything pre-modern, it's icons. You know, I mean, and even my tribe of, you know, my ancestors, well, not my biological ancestors, but my church ancestors were iconoclasts. And here I'm listening to Jonathan Pageau, and I'm, you know, at the same time over the last number of years watching colleagues of mine sort of cozying up to Roman Catholic liturgy and Greek Orthodox iconography. And to me, it's like, well, that's interesting. Why are you doing that? And in that vein, Jonathan Pageau has this rich imagery of, you know, the Garden of Eden is a mountain, and mountains are very big in the imagery. And well, what happens? I live just a few miles, pretty close to the most important estuary in California, which is the California Delta. And the water flows water, let's think of it in theological terms, the water comes down from the sky, flows onto the mountain, and runs down to the ocean. A number of years ago, there was, if you go into Sausalito, which is out over in the Bay Area, there's the Bay Area model. And because this church is of Dutch ancestry, and because Dutchmen love playing with water, this church was founded by a lot of water engineers that were, recruited to California to build dams for things. Well, and then they told me about this building in Sausalito, California, which is the Bay Area model. So I go there, and before they had computer modeling, they built an enormous model. I mean, it's big as a huge auditorium, and it's the whole Bay Area and all the river systems and water. And they keep this thing going, and they have water that goes in and water that goes out. And they model the entire ecosystem of the estuary of the Bay Area. And this is really cool. And then I thought, why did they build this thing? Well, they built it because in the 50s, everybody was worried because California never has enough water. And they said, what we should really do, we keep sending all this water to the ocean. That's dumb. Let's build this giant cork and cork up the delta and have this giant reservoir at the end of the Sacramento and American and San Joaquin rivers and keep all the fresh water for ourselves. And so they built a big model to model it. And somebody along the way said, that's not a good idea. We're going to mess up all kinds of things that we're not aware of because we're nervous about our water supply. And so they didn't do it, which was a really good thing. But they built the model. But then I began to think, that's very much like what the church has done for a long time. We build these big walls, and we want to keep all the water. And what happens in churches is you get a lot of stagnant water. And then I begin to recognize, I read people like Tom Holland and others and begin to appreciate the fact that, well, we have all these little lines in our culture. We have church and not church and believer and unbeliever. And all of those things are important and functional in their own right. But I'm way more secular. And many of even the most fundamentalist Christians I know are way more secular than they really believe. Because when I meet like Christians from Africa or Haiti, where I was a missionary, or other places, it's like those people are not anywhere near as secular as these people in these fundamentalist places. They're really very secular, but they don't admit it. They don't know it. And then I meet all of these people who are like, I'm a new atheist. All of the new atheist things about the sky daddy and craziness and mind virus, all that stuff. Yeah. I listen to them and I think, yeah, but you know what? When it comes down to your moral matrix, there's so much Jesus in you. You just don't. Oh, yeah. And it's,
man, I often get confused of being the worst atheist ever. I'm just the most disappointing atheist because I in my teens, I was all about the new atheist, Sky Daddy, Flying Spaghetti Monster, and I'm not above having my chuckles about them to this day, but because I can take the jokes as much as I can get them or give them, but in the last decade or so, I always find myself saying, okay, religion is a phenomenon that happened. Whether I believe any of the claims in the book is relevant, I need to understand what's going on here, and I need to understand it well enough so that I'm not going to a wafer and drink some wine and think that anything is happening there, right? For whatever reason, that set of beliefs is not going to activate in my brain. But to the extent that there's what you might call a baby in that bathwater, I have just as much interest as any other human being in saving that life, right? And for my own benefit and the benefit of my community. Where I get frustrated and where I use the Flying Spaghetti Monster as my sort of steam release valve for that frustration is I see a lot of people with the tub so overfull that the baby is drowning.
Okay.
Right.
Good analogy.
So I think you gotta bathe the baby and then drain the water away.
Baby Jesus.
Yeah. But and that's, and that goes to my point, because I'm listening to these sides and thinking we're not anywhere near as far apart as we imagine in some respects. And so what really the Jordan Peterson thing sort of pushed me down into was like I said, when I find something that's interesting, I want to dig deeper and find out what's really going on. And so I want to know, well, where are the lines really? And how important are they? And where are the important lines? And what's true? And so, I've just been digging and digging and digging, and and I've done this all my life, but the only thing that's new over the last 3 years is that I started doing it thinking out loud on YouTube, and people watched and participated. And that was, and I probably only got the sense that could happen because I was watching Jordan Peterson do it and thinking, well, this is stirring up the kinds of things I want to see. So what if I do some of this too? And now I don't have 2 million YouTube followers, for which I'm frankly grateful, because as the point you went to before, once a certain scale hits, now suddenly you have all these other different kinds of problems. And what was fun, at least for a moment with the IDW, is it looked like, ooh, this can be done at scale and good things can happen. But this might go back to C.S. Lewis's point about Martin Luther. If those darn theology students in Wittenberg hadn't translated the Latin into the German, well, we wouldn't have had the Protestant Reformation. Well, you can't do this math. But
would there have been a reforming of the Catholic Church?
Well, and Luther did do that. I mean, over a long period of time, a lot of the problems that Luther complained about in the Roman Catholic Church, they're no longer with us. The church is very different, and the church changed a lot more in the 200 years after Luther than it did in the 200 years before Luther, but everything changed. You do have the Enlightenment. You do, at Luther's time, you had belief in texts. So at Luther's time, if you wanted to learn physics, you learned Aristotle. 200 years after Luther, if you wanted to learn physics, you go out and do experiments. Right. And a lot of that is because part of what the Protestant Reformation sparked was a skepticism about the ancient text, which, of course, the optimism about the ancient text was the Renaissance humanism that brought about Erasmus and then Luther and the crisis in the church. And then with the complete collapse of the old regimes, the Enlightenment philosophers were looking for a new stable foundation upon which to construct their world. They're very Christian world in many ways, but upon which to construct it. And so they used some blend of empiricism and reason. And so empiricism and reason, go back and forth, sort of like Plato and Aristotle again. But now we're getting to the point where, again, we've realized that, well, we've been fighting about reason and empiricism, and we've completely forgotten the fact that we're part of the system too.
Okay.
And now what? So that's sort of to bring it all the way
around.
Yeah.
And okay, so Ryan, you mentioned about the idea of there was the Reformation that happened, and it wasn't quick and easy. 200 years, like in between what's the name of the school, the
Royal Society or the Invisible College?
Yeah. So there's this time in between those that this could be maybe sped up if we play our cards right. So how do we?
Well, I think it's going to speed up no matter what.
Okay. Is it disastrous then if we don't maybe get a handle on it through these like IDW protocol / Estuary? And where do you see the idea of Estuary compared to your IDW protocol? Sorry, that's a lot of questions.
I would see it as another facet of the same phenomenon,
okay.
right? And I think, there's not even just two of them, right? It seems like, every couple of weeks we meet someone who's like, oh yeah, I'm doing this project over here that I call the Flormborgen. And it's my version of, the grassroots IDWS thing where it came from a completely different thing. So that's actually really encouraging, right? Because it's not going to be one project that it's going to be. And that was always my frustration with the IDW is I looked at it, it's like, oh, I don't know how much internet history you guys know. But if I say ARPANET, does that mean anything to you? Andrea, so ARPANET was sort of the prototype
the internet.
Okay. Yeah, and it was like a bunch of universities with connected over phone lines, right? And so there were maybe like a couple dozen universities connected over very basic communications protocols. But it was the forerunner of the internet, and I sort of viewed the IDW as ARPANET for this thing, right? It's a couple dozen, and ARPANET didn't turn one-to-one like into the modern internet. I don't know that there's probably some continuity between the two networks, but that's the thing about a network is that when you go into a tunnel, your cell phone is no longer connected to the internet. Your cell phone is no longer part of the internet because it's not able to speak the protocol to the other nodes of the whole. So when someone stops acting in good faith, if they momentarily become possessed by, the demon of Twitter and start acting like a jerk, then they are not part of the network anymore. Until they sort of take a deep breath and calm down, and then they rejoin the network. The principle I'm trying to evoke here is that the action is what defines you being part of the category, and as the action changes, you are or are not part of the category of something IDW-esque or Estuary-esque or Flormborgen-esque, and I think that's an important thing to tease out, because it's the worst thing that happened to the concept of the IDW was the very quick solidification in the public consciousness of it as a group of people. It's like, oh, the IDW, and it happened time after time after time. It's like, oh, the IDW is the people in Barry Weiss's article, right? Or the IDW is defined by opposition to left-wing politics, or the IDW is the people on this IDW website that was set up by some random college student, right, who had no affiliation with any of the people, right? Everyone was trying to circle around this definition, and this is where I got into protocol land and just realizing, no, it's a network, and a network, the way you define a network is by the method of interaction, because you can have, because the internet is a ship of Theseus, right? You pick up you remove a computer, add a computer, remove a computer, add a computer, remove a computer, add a computer. But the internet has continuity for the last 20 years, despite being largely different computers. So a human network would do exactly the same thing. A human network that's trying to achieve what I think we're trying to achieve, which is I think there's a lot of things we're trying to achieve, or at least that I would hope that a network of people interested in this would achieve. What primary among them is violence reduction.
Okay, I was going to ask, what are they? So you have some in mind.
So to Paul's story about C.S. Lewis, right, saying, the problems of the Reformation that have been handled with pipe smoke among friends over whiskey and beer. And I am of that same bent, and at various different moments, I'm more or less optimistic about such a thing being able to happen that way, because you're in a race, right? The adults in the room are perpetually racing with the lunatics who are threatening to take the asylum, and in several different domains have taken the asylum already. So the question is, can the pipe smoke and whiskey and beer conversation that is genial and constructive, can it outpace the destructive war conversation? The problem is that it's psychologically, it's way easier to jump to a conclusion than it is to think one out. So almost by definition, the congenial conversation is going to be slower than the rage-filled accusatory conversation.
But the bonds
so that doesn't mean we can't mitigate it.
Okay, because I was going to say the bonds are stronger in conversations amongst the friends smoking the pipe in the back room of
they're always the ones that win.
It's the long game.
They're always the ones that actually...
Yeah.
And they totally... It's always those conversations that actually yield the end state, the stable equilibrium at the end state. The question is, can those conversations preempt the violent violent conversations, right?
Yes. Okay.
And and it's domain specific. Sometimes they can, if you have enough foresight to have if you have the conversation up front, and you've got some people, and maybe this is what might make now a special moment in history, is that part of the nature of this communications medium we have could allow enough of the thoughtful conversations to happen far enough in advance of when they precipitate, such that as new crises arise, we have a record. We say, like, actually, this group over here in Sacramento, or this group over here in Tempe, Arizona, or this group over here in South Africa figured it out 2 years ago when they were dealing with a local model of this problem, and we can learn from them, right? Rather than, because the part of the world-changing nature of the internet is not just distribution as it was with the printing press, but it's also near instantaneous collapse of geography, right? So in a way, you could see a lot of violent altercations is people having the same problem over and over and over again, just different sets of people having the same problems with each other over and over and over again. But if you can resolve that style of problem once or twice, we might be able to spread the solution to it faster than the spread of the problem, almost like a memetic vaccine.
Well, can you explain memetic vaccine? Because I don't know what you mean by that.
So this is totally off the wall, but I'll try and keep it concise.
Okay.
This metaphor popped in my head after the Christchurch massacre, I think it was, in New Zealand, because everyone was talking about whether or not you should read the guy's manifesto, because he did one of these long rambling manifestos, and it was also, there was this huge argument that it was like filled with online culture troll stuff, 4chan. So it was like designed to be deceptive, and what part of it was genuine. It was just designed to like make everyone lose their collective minds, which is what happened around it. So people were arguing that like, no, we can't republish this because people don't have the context to read it without going crazy. It sets off a bomb in your brain to read such a thing. So naturally, after reading all this commentary, I had to find it.
Naturally.
And I read it, and I got some of the references, and some of the references I didn't get, and I had to look up. And then as I was reading it, I remembered parts of the commentary. I'm just like, okay, well, the Guardian definitely got this wrong, and the Atlantic got that wrong, and so everyone was wrong about parts of it. But I saw the interplay that it was riding this knife edge between like a Unabomber style polemic and a 4chan troll.
Oh.
Right. And those two styles were like, it was as if a virus had went through a bat and a pangolin and created this thing that was like super, it was this weird Frankenstein of a memetic attack on people.
Oh.
So as people were discussing, like, you know, what's the proper way what's the journalistic ethics, I guess, of working with this source material, I came up with the idea of a memetic vaccine.
Okay.
Right? If you just release this thing, then it's like you've been doing bioweapons research and you release the virus from the lab. But if the thing is out in the world, then the proper thing to do is for some experts to study it, sequence it, and find out the deactivated version of the appropriate proteins in this meme space, and then put that into a textbook that then serves as a memetic vaccine. So you read the deactivated version of the manifesto, and that protects you from the weaponized.
Okay, and then no one will read it because they don't want
the psychological reason.
They're like, oh, I don't want to read a textbook things. So someone else.
Well, not a textbook
no, I'm just
thing,
kidding.
but you release the article.
Yes, I think that it would be definitely more helpful. I'm like, I don't want to read a textbook. Thank you, Ryan. You can read it for me. No, but I'm just reacting like the regular normies who are like, that sounds like a lot of work, Ryan. But it is a lot of work.
Well, no, it's not a full textbook. Right. I'm saying it's a page of a textbook.
Okay.
It's something that you would, when compiling a textbook, you would feature.
Right. Okay.
And I go that direction because I think that media literacy in general should be a required course.
Okay.
Almost, K through year, you should get another course on media literacy drilled into your brain, because if you don't know what strings they're trying to pull on you, you're going to lose your mind.
Right. Yes, that's why.
That's a whole nother tangent.
Yeah, that's why, Paul. You don't want if you had young kids, you didn't want any of young kids, tweens or teens. You wouldn't want them to be YouTube stars, right?
I don't even want my 20-year-olds to be YouTube stars. I don't know that I should be a YouTube star. Okay. I mean, we don't appreciate the power of what we're dealing with here. You know, the fact that families all over the United States long for their children to become NBA or NFL athletes. Well, I can understand that. But what is that actually going to do to the person? You know, I saw a statistic once, something like 70% of NFL players are broke and or divorced 4 years after their retirement from the NFL.
Oh, yeah.
Well, lottery winners. You know, there's tremendous power at work here in the kinds of systems that we have created, and we as human beings are seriously outmatched as compared to these. And again, as someone who knows a little bit of theology and the Bible, that maps fairly well onto a lot of what the Bible talks about in terms of principalities and powers. These are not human constructs. They are maybe constructs of our invention, but they are far beyond us. And we have to figure out, similar to this, I really love that idea of a memetic vaccine, similar to that, well, how can we actually, and the church has actually been trying to do this for centuries, how can we vaccinate young people to encounter these principalities and powers and not have them take their lives? And they don't take their lives like a lion or a tiger. They take their lives from the inside out.
That's a good picture and scary, actually.
Yeah, to your point about the NFL players and the YouTube stars, I think it's all so much gladiatorial combat, right? It's we who are about to die salute you at a certain level. It's just people, so much, anyone who pursues a a fame-oriented career, right? To where, you know, their bread is made by virtue of their exposure and their continued exposure in the attention economy. They are gladiators. That it's less bloody, but the consequences seem the same, and even the function seems the same, right? You know, pundits and journalists are journalists aren't journalists anymore. They're op-ed writers, and they're going to battle on Twitter for the entertainment of the mob, and cancel culture is the summary thumb direction of the emperor deciding whether you live or die at the end of it. There's the Internet of Beefs. That I love that article. So the frustrating part, you know, it's one, you know, if you recognize that we've always had blood sport, getting, as much as it's still blood sport and it's appealing to the worst angels of our nature, if you recognize, okay, at a certain degree, this has always existed, probably always will, and hey, at least we're getting less physically violent with it, that's got to count for something. That's all well and good, but it's like the emperor is throwing games in the Colosseum while Rome is burning down, right? So it's time. We've got a lot of work to do outside of watching this blood sport, and no one can take their eyes off of it. Which scares the crap out of me.
So what do you mean by work to do? Is that to do with if people would pursue what's like meaningful as opposed to what's entertaining?
I think that very much be part of it. I mean, look around. We've got plenty of problems that need solving.
It seems worse though on the internet than it does offline. To me,
it absolutely does. Little Canadian, because that's part of the sport of it.
Okay.
And there's also the thing, like, you know, we talk about the Reformation and say Europe was on fire, but I'm sure there was no shortage of green grass meadows that were not actually on fire, right? You can look out a window at any given time, but collectively, it's sort of like the idea of the mostly peaceful protest.
Okay, mostly. Okay.
Right, like.
Okay, Paul, I need your response.
Well, and so when I told Peter Limberg that I thought that a culture war was an excellent time to be a Christian, I think it's because when the church has been at its best, and the church has certainly, you know, maybe the church has been a mostly bloody protest. I mean, the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War trampled a lot of green grass in Europe during those conflicts. But what we see, and you know, and I think, you know, Ross Douthat and Eric Weinstein. Ross Douthat was on Eric Weinstein's podcast, and Eric Weinstein said, "Well, I think if Jesus was around, he'd just be basically memed to death." And
he's already memed.
I don't
enough.
know. Yeah, he's memed plenty, but you don't.
The crucifixtion.
It's good. It's so part of what I began to notice when. So I started making videos. I've made commentary videos about Jordan Peterson, and I certainly dug up enough low-level blood sport motivation, because some people wanted to see a Christian minister endorse Jordan Peterson, and some people wanted to see a Christian minister take down Jordan Peterson, and so that element is always with us. But so I started doing that, and then people wanted to talk to me, and so then I started talking to people like we're talking now, and I began to notice patterns in the conversation, and so I suggested to some of the individuals, would it be okay if I recorded this conversation on Zoom? And then instead of just referring to those conversations, well, why don't I post them on my channel? Because why not? And so that took up, that began to become a thing of its own. And so we were watching conversations between each other. And then because my channel grew and I was harder to get a hold of, the people who I had talked to started talking to each other on YouTube. And eventually we started a Discord server and on and on. And what I began to notice was that a culture was spreading. And you know, when we've talked about Estuary, I've talked about the fact that it's more caught than taught, because part of what we're seeing, at least with YouTube and to a degree with podcasts, texts are fairly low resolution in terms of what's being transmitted. Conversation and video is a little higher resolution, and you can include some culture and some style and some practice, and for lack of a better word, drama and liturgy in how we're talking. And so we started a Discord server, and I began to notice that the culture in the Discord server was a little bit different from the cultures in a lot of the other Discord servers. And part of that was because in these conversations that a whole bunch of people had watched, we began to develop a culture and style and practices, and I noticed this at the local meetup too, that began to self-propagate. And we began as a community to learn what kinds of conversations were satisfying, were productive, where people would leave. John Vervaeke, another node in this network, John Vervaeke calls it dialogos, where people come at the conversation from two different perspectives. And whereas there might not be any tribal jumps that we can track and chart and gamify and turn into blood sport, but both people leave the conversation feeling, I've grown from that conversation. And I've grown in community, and I know more about the world. And my low resolution picture of my internet adversary is now richer and fuller, and kindness and generosity have grown rather than just ambition and a desire for vengeance or destruction. And what I began to see happening is that, okay, this is happening. So then my next questions were, how can we keep this? How can we continue to grow this? It can't grow too fast, even though we want it right away, because again, all these other motivations, very quickly it's blood sport. And one of the critical things was this conversation I'd done with Bausch, which was, he's a guy who's out there in the internet, and I didn't know. So there's this modern day debate channel, and okay, we want you to talk to Bausch. I didn't know who Bausch was. He didn't know who I was. And the question was basically something like, was Jordan Peterson helpful or not? Okay. Yeah. And I took the pro and he took the against. And then, a little bit before my conversation, a more prominent YouTuber than I am, who I know personally, sent me an email and said, you better be very careful talking to him, because I had a conversation with him and it got ugly and blah, blah, blah. I thought, okay, well, we'll see. And the conversation was a delight. I mean, he took a position of he's a gender anarchist or something like that. And obviously I was quite a bit more traditional in my approach, but we had a productive conversation. And, what was funny was that some of his audience was really upset by this, because they wanted to see me get owned as the Jordan Peterson guy and as the Christian guy, and people would Google positions that the Christian Reformed Church holds. And so you've got to, knock down Paul because of his ideas about such and such a thing. And it didn't go that way. And even just recently, he was doing a conversation with someone, and someone tagged me on Twitter and said, Vaush is still mulling over your talk with him, and said, I'd talk to him again. And we've got some real differences, but we both grew in the process. And so my point in all of this, and in Estuary, because very quickly some of the ideas of Estuary were, well, we've got to, and it's like, no, let's keep doing what we're doing, because what I've been noticing is that just like little children learn from their parents, we learn from watching each other in ways that are pre-conscious and deep and subtle. And so, and of course, anybody who's participated in organized religion for thousands of years should know this. It's all these tiny little things that actually go into creating what we're doing now, which if we had to sit down and actually explicate everything we're doing, it would take us hours and hours, and we couldn't finally exhaust all of the subtleties and complexities that we're actually involved in right now. And we're doing it seamlessly, fairly unconsciously, and productively. And now we're doing it with a tool that, Andrea's going to edit this thing, and and then she's going to post it on her channel, and I'll post it on my channel, and people will talk about it, and it'll sort of go into, I think, the plus side of what's going on right now. And that's what I want to see happen.
Right.
Yeah. It's a bit like, if you want as many people as possible to play basketball, right? Do you print up a bunch of books on the rules of basketball? A lot of textbooks that Andrea would love to read.
I love it. Love it.
Or do you make a bunch of basketballs and build a bunch of hoops and have some people trot around and demonstrate dribbling and layups and free throws, and then say, hey, come on over, toss the ball over, and say, start dribbling, put this ball in that hoop, we'll get the rest later.
There's actually, have you guys seen the Brendan Fraser film called, what's it called? Oh my goodness.
Blast from the Past, The Mummy.
Blast from the Past.
I saw it years ago.
Okay, so I can't believe I slipped my mind. Wow, when you're on the spot, you forget things. So
I'm a
yeah. So he me as well, sir. So this was one that
is he Canadian?
He actually is, and we always know who's Canadian.
We always get the stars from Canada. So many of them up there.
I always know who's a Canadian.
Anyway, go on.
Yeah. So, okay, he grows up in a bunker for 30 years because plane falls in his house during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His dad thinks that it's a bomb, nuclear fallout, whatever. So, and his dad is Christopher Walken. And Christopher Walken's trying to teach his little Brendan Fraser son, who isn't Brendan Fraser, but is a star, a little kid who looks like him, what baseball is. And he's like, but why does he run? Because he must. That's the little dialogue that is the same thing over and over again. And you see him as he grows up, the because he must little thing. And then he finally sees it when he comes out into the world, and he's like, because he must. Oh, you need to see it. It's exactly what you said with the basketball thing, but it was just in my memory of my, of my nostalgic movies that I forgot the title of. So anyway, so I go and watch it. It's a really good film, people. But yeah, it's that you need to do. There's some spaces that human beings can't reason away. You've got to act it out. That's what Peterson says, acting out before you even understand, even before you even put words to it. And I'm even gaining words to talking about what's happening the more I watch these conversations as Paul says, conversations that are going on. He adds the Z or a Z to that. That's just, I don't know. You say it that way and everyone just picks up on it. On Bridges of Meaning. But yeah, in the Bridges of Meaning talks, I've been watching and talks I've had with Paul, it gets more and more, oh, this is what's happening. Okay, I think I have better words to explain what's happening now. And we need to continue that to know exactly what's happening. But I'd say the thing that I've picked out the most is a little bit of what you just said, Paul, is this, it's not a debate. Ryan, you were saying about the new atheist stuff getting put on YouTube. It was sort of debate-like, right? And I feel like there's a bit of an evolution of that into not as debate-like being the goal to who wins, but what can I learn from this other side? What can I take and add into my own little matrix, and what can you take and add into yours? That's sort of the vibe I get is the goal of all of this. Thoughts?
Yeah.
I just end with a statement.
And I think it's really important goal, right? Because so I worry about political division and political violence, especially in the States right now. And so much of it is embodied by the dehumanizing rhetoric of the opposing tribe. And it goes back to 2016 in the Democratic primaries. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were on stage together, and the closing question of one of their debates. And the question was, what is the largest threat to America? And Bernie Sanders said, climate change. It's like, okay, that's standard, aggressive left-wing guy answer. Like, that's played well to the room. And I can believe that. Hillary Clinton said, the Republicans.
Could you be more divisive?
Yeah. So in that moment, she won the primary and lost the general election.
What Republican in their right mind is gonna vote for her when she calls them the enemy and deplorables at another point in time?
Right. So
and both sides have been playing that game for a while.
So it was just it was this one moment in time that it was like the scales fell from my eyes, and the systematic antagonism at play was just like, okay, there's no way this ends well. So it's so important to build a better model of who would have supported Trump and for what reason, and not the reasons that, oh, if you supported Trump, it must be because you're a racist, right? That I'm sure that there is a subset of people for which that is the case, but it can't possibly be all of them. And it's sloppy thinking to think so. And not only is it sloppy, but it is dehumanizing in the same way that actual racism is dehumanizing, to reduce people to a single category, no matter what category that is. And it leads predictably to the othering of groups of people that leads to violent conflict, which, to my mind, that is the project. To the extent that there's a project, just about everything else I do is a means to that end of violence reduction.
Okay.
Or violence prevention. So conversation features heavily in that, because conversation fundamentally is the alternative to violence. If there is a conflict, you can have a verbal conflict or an armed conflict. And I would much prefer verbal in all cases. That's sort of the success condition. Especially as the stakes get higher and higher, where you've got, it's one thing when armed conflict meant bow and arrow and a broadsword. It's another thing entirely when armed conflict between nation states could end the experiment itself.
Paul, those are the stakes that Ryan sees. What are the stakes that you see?
Well, I agree that, at the heart of the Christian religion is a man who, when the temple guard came to take him, one of his disciples takes out a sword, and probably not real good with it, him being a fisherman, only winds up cutting off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And Jesus takes that ear and reattaches it, and by doing so, in a sense, says, if anybody's blood is going to be shed in this conflict, let it be mine. And of course, his disciples run away in terror and hide for the rest of the weekend. And Jesus is Jesus is tried in a kangaroo court, and Pontius Pilate, who is a corrupt Roman middleman, is pressured into executing him and releasing a legitimate Jewish nationalist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the story. Then, of course, the story that Christians believe is that he rises from the dead. And if I had risen from the dead after a Roman execution, my first stop would have been Pontius Pilate's house and say, "How do you like me now?"
Mic drop.
But Jesus, that's right. But Jesus doesn't do that. And Jesus' disciples go on to die their own deaths, often at the hands of their enemies, and Christians would continue to do that. But they would also do so with the firm belief of their master that said, your marching order is to love your neighbor as yourself, and that goes all the way up to and includes your enemies. And this is how Christians ought to behave. Now, Christians most often don't behave that way because there are very real biological reasons why we don't want to behave that way, because when you turn the other cheek, you usually wind up getting hit twice. Mm-hmm. And most of us know that. But Christianity has, in a number of ways, I believe, helped bring the world to a position that social need not be a zero-sum game. I think that if you read, one way of reading the Bible is to understand that, well, killing all the bad people and saving only the good people was a world redemption policy tried in Noah's flood. And basically what the story says is, okay, so God picks out the best man in the world and saves his kids, because that'd be awfully brutal not to save his own kids. So saves his kids, but soon after, daddy gets drunk and one son laughs at him. And it just goes downhill from there again. And so one way to understand the Bible is that we keep doing this to each other. And then the story goes that God sends his son to be our victim, and that this sets into motion a process by which we start working through things together rather than just killing our enemies. And we're really bad at that, and we keep doing it, and we keep doing it poorly. But part of the reason I am happy that even my atheist neighbors who think that the Bible, the world would be better if the Bible had never been written, and all of those kinds of things, actually are on the same page with me, that thinking that talking is better than hitting, and love is a goal worth sharing. So I'm happy to work on those terms. And so that's what I think Christians are here for and here to do. I think Christians have an additional motivation that if they actually believe in the resurrection, they hopefully are motivated to pursue this agenda with a sacrificial hope that even if I lose today, I will win in the age to come. That's pretty powerful. And so hopefully we don't have Christians driving airplanes into buildings or imagining that we win at the cost of the blood of our enemies. But it is a very complex thing, and loving doesn't just always simply mean being a doormat or laying down your position. Nobody, I think, made stronger, more compact arguments for the kinds of things he was dealing with in his culture war than Jesus. He was tremendously skilled at it. And the only difficult thing about Jesus is that he paid for it with his life. And most of us look at that and say, I want another option. But I see the Christian life in these terms. And I think churches should be places where Christians learn this.
It's interesting you're bringing up terms, because I remember in IDW protocol, Ryan defined the terms was not even the first step, it was step 0.
Step 0, yeah. Define and distinguish your terms, always.
But your response to what Paul was saying.
So there's some Jesus smuggling.
Yeah, I know. You're like, oh, here's the preacher man. Here he comes.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'm curious whether the can of worms I'm about to open is wise, but it seems like too good of an opportunity to pass up. So speaking of fishermen, let's open the worms and go fishing.
Cool.
Because one, working on those terms, right? Talking is better than hitting, as a fundamental realization. I'm also happy to work on those terms, and that's been the overarching thing that's taken the heat out of my new atheist frustrations, right? Since being younger, probably also just a function of not being a teenager or an early 20-something anymore. But I do wonder, in almost all respects, that is enough. But in terms of the project of humanity, the elephant in the room, and maybe this is a good heuristic. If there's an elephant in the room, introduce it, right? The elephant in the room is not so much belief in the resurrection of Jesus, right? Or belief in the flood, as much as those are interesting things to bicker about, and people have done it to death. To me, the elephant in the room is belief in a personal afterlife, right? Because that strikes me as psychologically game-changing for a worldview, right? And it's of interest to me on the one hand how, when I don't think about it, everything seems to sort of like line up anyway. Like it doesn't, in day-to-day practice with interacting with the people that I know that do believe in an afterlife, of whatever variety, versus the people that don't, I don't notice much functional difference, right? There's enough variety everywhere that enough of them are awesome people and enough of them are jerks that it doesn't seem detectable in the day-to-day. But when every time it actually crosses my mind, I wonder, number one, how is it that this seems imperceptible in my day-to-day interactions? And number two, is it actually imperceptible at the second and third and fourth order effects of day-to-day actions and orientations towards life, and policy positions? There's no shortage of irony that Trump was the pro-life candidate and got the pro-life vote, and I'm wondering, how much is a consequence of that second and third order effects. So I'd love to get both of your thoughts on that sort of
let Paul take
domain of question.
Paul, I will kindly allow you to answer this one.
I think it's a great point. I think just as I say, atheists have far more have been influenced more deeply by Christianity than they recognize. Most Christians have been deeply influenced by material secularity than they appreciate. And so I would, just as a pastor, affirm the fact that many people who go to church and practice Christianity, when it comes down to facing the reality of their biological death in this world, have a lot of doubts. Okay, so that's common. So your sample of looking at people doesn't surprise me. I read a book a number of years ago by a scholar named Miroslav Volf, who was living in the breakdown of what was known as Yugoslavia. Serbia, Croatia, Herzegovina, all of those civil wars that broke down. He made an observation that part of what intensified the civil wars, and I think we're seeing that today, is that if in a sense we don't have a how to phrase this, an offshore reality where the idealized fullness of reward and punishment can play out in our own imaginary, the temptation is always to shorten that and bring that here into this world. For example, if you're in the midst of a genocidal civil war and you don't believe this is the example he used, you don't believe there is afterlife judgment, then, well, guess what? Hitler and Stalin and Mao, they all got away with it. Well, maybe Stalin was poisoned by someone, but for the most part, he got away with it. And what does that mean then? So that's on one side. The other side is if you have no belief or expectation or anticipation that the sacrifices which almost always need to be made in this world in order to arrive at some semblance of a talking peace rather than a bloody fight. Because in almost every case, Democrats and Republicans, if they're actually governing effectively, they're going to have to compromise.
Yeah.
Which means that your ideals are not going to be realized, and they're certainly not going to be realized in the short span of your time frame. And now you may have some wonderful ideals that, well, future generations will get there, but I see secularization as intensifying both the need to punish the evil and bring in utopian visions of the good here and now, because I've only got 80 or 90 or 100 years to live. And so functionally at a pragmatic level, I actually see worldviews, and the majority of worldviews throughout human history have imagined some type of afterlife by which punishment and reward is properly mediated, partly because we have so little confidence in the fact that justice will be meted out in this world, that actually it's a fairly pragmatic thing to say, okay, you will get your reward after. They will get their punishment after. And in this frame, that sort of helps keep things, I don't really need to go and kill him and destroy his family before plucking out his eyes, because God is going to get him. And what's remarkable that I see again and again in newspapers, like recently there was someone in California that was a serial rapist and murderer in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s here, the Golden Gate Killer. I mean, and he was, it's amazing how many very secular people get up in court and say, and I hope you burn in hell. And it's like, we don't often talk about hell, do we? But for this guy, sure comes in handy, making me feel better, even the fact that he's 75 years old and maybe only has 10 years to do in jail at the government's expense. So that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I see it. The false starts. I understand full well the utility of the belief, right? And it makes perfect sense to me why it would have emerged that cultures that had that belief would drastically outperform cultures that didn't, because it would allow you to put a pin in it, and the culture would be far more stable. I guess part of what worries me, and maybe this is the same, this sort of speaks to the baby bathwater situation, right? Is that if there's a baby, I'm pretty damn sure that's actually it. It not necessarily the belief, but a belief that performs that function that you just described. Now, myself and my comrades of the New Atheist of the United New Atheist Front will not be similar. You know, we can't unbite the apple, right? From our perspective, like we're past our ability to conceivably have that specific belief. Now, most new atheists will stop there, and they will say, "Ha ha ha, Sky Daddy, yada yada yada." What I want to accomplish is to find the belief that I can believe that will perform that function. And to your point, I think you need it too, because your observation that most Christians are far more secular than they would claim, to the extent that that secularization of the church extends to that belief, it means they've drowned the baby too, even if they're going to church every Sunday, right? So I think we all collectively need to find, discover, create the set of beliefs that we can believe wholly in our minds and our hearts that will perform that function. Do you have any hints as to what that might be? So
well,
I'd really love to find it.
Yeah. Last surveys I've seen, somewhere between 85 and 90% of Americans believe in an afterlife where justice is meted out. And so I appreciate the fact, and I respect the small contingent of skeptics with respect to afterlife, but you might have a herd immunity question going on here, where you know, you need 90% of the population to actually believe it, even if you're nerdy, heady atheists and 10% are a little skeptical about it. I also don't see those kinds stepping up at funerals to do many speeches. And so I'm not anxious about it in that frame. And I'm also not. Well, this gets into the question, you know, well, I can see if the belief in the resurrection, I can see that the belief in the resurrection or the belief in an afterlife is useful. Even people who have, let's say, deconstructed their Christianity, most of the studies being done on those people who now consider themselves religiously unaffiliated or skeptical or whatnot, they haven't, for the most part, deconstructed belief in ghosts, aliens, UFOs. It seems to be a basic function of human beings, and I don't think it's going anywhere.
Okay, I do have something. It took me a while as I was thinking, I was listening to you guys. So it might not be for those new atheist minds. So this might be not even answering your question. But so what I'm seeing is, and what I'm seeing Paul talk about, and what I'm seeing happen since the emergence of Jordan Peterson and the IDW is, so we're seeing evangelicals moving back towards not even Catholicism. We're skipping over that because we don't like them, but we're going to the Orthodox Church. A lot of evangelicals or fundamentalist evangelicals moving towards sort of Jonathan Pageau's space of wanting to understand symbolism. It's not literal. It's symbolic. What does that mean? What does that do for my understanding of these religious symbols or these religious icons or these religious concepts? So we're seeing a step in a different direction from that religious space, but then going over to these non-religious people. I mean, you could say the young fellas who are the Peterson followers, and I'm a Peterson follower, so I'm a lady, but there are a lot of young guys who follow, right? Who followed him. So, and a lot of those guys were in that new atheist camp. Maybe they're a little young for like coming up in it, but there's actually across the board age-wise. And they were like, was sad and stuck in nihilism. And they haven't crossed over to faith, but they call themselves Christian atheists now. Or they call themselves maybe more agnostic, or they're looking to commune with the transcendent, we'll say. What does that even mean? Well, it depends what you mean by transcendence, you know? But the concept of there being, like, that us being outside of the narrative, that I think was really big in the 90s. And no, we're not. We're not that view of God or whatever you would use. We're in it. You can't step away from it. I know that's what the postmodernists were like trying to deconstruct, right? And they went too far, but that makes sense. And so to me, it seems like it doesn't have to be necessarily traditional religion. Well, for some, it's like really traditional, going back to like the Orthodox Church. But it's stepping into like why is Sam Harris focusing so much? And again, I don't know. This could be old information because I haven't been keeping up. Well, on his meditation app, that to me seems like a communing with the transcendent. And so the words could be, you could change the wording, but it seems like doing something that is different from just going along in life, living without paying attention to something outside of yourself. Or maybe it's internal. Maybe it's like the transcendent is internal in that space, but it's still not easy to access in either way. So what do you think? What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's a matter of there's stated belief and then there's embodied belief. There's there's the thing I tell you I believe and the thing I demonstrate I believe by the way I act. And maybe this is what we've sort of been circling around, is that the stated beliefs are what we argue about, right? But my observation that, belief in heaven and hell and belief in the resurrection doesn't actually seem to strike me as so prevalent as I'm just interacting with people out in the world. It's because as much as the stated beliefs might be different, the embodied or acted beliefs are in fact the same. To your Paul's point of the Christians with more secularism that they want, or the atheists with more Jesus than they want to admit. And to your point about the herd immunity as well was, I think, really good. My worry is that it's sort of the same worry of, preference falsification ahead of the 2016 election. I wonder, if there's polling that suggests a certain number of Americans state that they believe in an afterlife where justice is properly meted out. I don't know that I observe, and I've got limited sample of experience. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, of all places. Currently live in a very urban center, so I know that that's a slice of life, but it's not the whole pie. But it strikes me that I see a far lower percentage than 90 actually conducting themselves in the day-to-day as if that's an embodied belief, even though it might be a stated belief. And it strikes me that the embodiment of that belief, that's the actual function that I'm concerned with and that I want to address by trying to find something that is embodiable and believable.
A number of years ago, George Gallup wrote a book entitled The Saints Among Us, and he basically selected out about 13% of the population that far outpaced everyone else in sacrificial generosity. And preachers wouldn't have jobs if people in church weren't so bad at being Christians. It sort of keeps us in work. And even though obviously in American culture, church participation as a voluntary activity, unlike in the Plymouth Bay colony. Well, I think actually the church is better off that way, but
okay, Paul, we only have so much
your
time.
points. I say that, Ryan, because I agree with your points, and it's just as, in being a pastor, part of the privilege you have in being a pastor is talking to not just church people, but often the relatives of church people who, when it gets to the point of, their end is coming soon, even individuals, even though they didn't live their life very well, and they certainly didn't live their life with a knowledge or a concern about final judgment and how they might perform in that test. It's basically how people are, in terms of, on the news. You can't watch American television and not hear the message: eat properly, exercise properly, see your doctor. I mean, this whole modern regime about how to live your best healthy life now, and the number of people that actually pursue it and live that way. One, like you say, an embodied belief, and then in a sense, the professed belief. So no, I very much take your point. And part of what you do as a pastor is, in fact, try to continue to remind at least those people who voluntarily subject themselves to my ministrations that these are the values of the faith. This is the framework. Now, when I say imaginary framework, I don't mean that pejoratively, but the framework within our imagination with which we live our lives. And these are the reasons why you should be generous and patient and forgiving and live like Jesus. So, but your point, I very much take your point. The difficulty I think we have is that we've been in the 1960s and 70s, Christians were seen as basically in alignment with the overall cultural project. And part of what happened in New Atheism is, whereas sort of in the 19th century, very smart people began to say, well, the Bible doesn't really get the science or the history right, but it has the morals right. So we'll kind of go along. Part of the flip that happened really after the Cold War was that we began to say, well, the Bible has the morals wrong too. And so now the church is not just a group full, an organization full of busybodies and prudes. Now they're a group full of they're organizations of evil people, because they vote for the wrong party. And when actually, in terms of Democrats and Republicans, they're kind of 50-50. It's that one side of one certain group of Christians gets all the press, and
oh yeah, no one gets elected as an atheist in America.
So, but all that probably very inelegantly and took too much time to say. I very much appreciate your point, because it's very true. And as a pastor, I very much feel it, because people think, well, if you tell people what to believe and do, they'll do it. And I think no pastor believes that.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, I have a question though with regards to the New Atheist Movement. I don't know if it's still considered a movement, or is it like it was history and now it's okay. So I don't know. We'll just say it is still vestigial.
Yeah. I mean, it was a YouTube movement, an early YouTube movement. I don't know what it was, and I don't really know who I was when it was happening, right? I was, I'm just about to turn 30, so the New Atheist
Oh, you're totally younger than
very
me.
much.
I did not know that.
You're both younger than me.
Yes.
It's the glasses.
No, I just think everyone's more confident and older than me on the internet. Anyway. I'm
but
weird.
But yeah, so like I don't really know it. You know, it's hard to disentangle those years of one's life and talk about the history of that time, even though you lived through it. I often run into the similar phenomenon, this wildly tangential, but I remember 9/11.
Yeah.
And I vaguely remember how the world changed, but I was just about to turn 11 on 9/11.
Right.
And so, talk about remembering age 0 to 10 and like really understanding and like the invention of the internet. It's a really, and I think this is where millennials have this weird gap bridging generation function, right? Because we're old enough to remember and have operated a rotary phone unironically.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we're young enough that Google is practically a third limb for us, right? It was introduced early enough. And that's a way crazy change in environment to have to straddle for a generation. And I think that's why maybe I facilitate in turns by, despite the fact that I'm a software developer as a profession, I find myself wanting to be a Luddite and throw the server racks into the ocean and just to go back to the pre-TikTok days, because I look around me and it's like I see so many cons, and then I go back and say, no, well, we do have Wikipedia, and Paul, like you, I'm a digger, so I consistently lose sleep by going 6 links too far past the original thing that I was supposed to be. I was like, oh, I'll just check up the Wikipedia article on this, and then 4 hours later, why am I reading about special relativity again?
Again. Well, okay.
Because it's so hard to understand. It's hard to imagine.
Well, because what I'm wondering with regards to, like, say, your expectation of your question of your expectation regarding like Christians and not seeing evidence of the belief in the afterlife or whatever set of things we could stick in there for that would work. Like, what are the expectations of, say, like the new atheists? Like, what are the expectations of what, of how they should be acting in the world? Like that's what I'm just wondering. Yeah, do you know what I mean? Like I just expect like a angry like. Are
you basically asking for my best guess so far?
Yeah.
How to create that baby and reintroduce it?
I'm wanting to hear. Yeah, like what? Okay. Because I think it's different from the Peterson, like, let's just go in between. Like, archetypes are the ideal, the God, the good. What's the difference? Like, I feel like that's...
Well, read the Bible like you would read Shakespeare.
Yeah, that's
right?
kind of what
he
straddles that line, but I don't feel like the new atheists do. So that's why I'm asking.
No. So, me personally, I do take the... I take the tack that the only difference between poetry and prophecy is how good it is.
Mm-hmm.
Really good poetry is indistinguishable from prophecy. And to the extent that you have wisdom traditions that create their canons of prophecy, and I'm perhaps using that term not as technically as Paul might, given.
No, actually, it's that's a better term than a lot of Christians imagine prophecy to be.
Okay, well, I'll take that as a compliment. So to the extent that I recognize that, if I come from the position that it's all just poetry, and we call the really, really good stuff prophecy. Now, prophecy in each religion is a category distinction, because your stuff is prophecy and everybody else's stuff is poetry, right? So I don't make the category distinction, but But in so doing, I can look around and say, okay, what is the sum total of set of things that everyone in the world has ever considered prophecy? Be like, okay, that's my poetry book. And I'm going to try and use, and it's similar to the Petersonian way of using, treating the Bible the way you would treat great literature. Or, I read, years ago, I read a book that was called The Bible as a History. And it was actually all about the Old Testament. But it was talking basically, it was fascinating because it's like, manna from heaven. Well, if you go to the region now and you go to the markets in Damascus or wherever it was, you can find this like honey-like substance. And it's basically honey that comes from these beetles on the leaves in that region. It's like, and it's sold as man, right? So it was this fascinating book filled with all these sorts of stories about, like, whether you believe that it was divinity making these things happen, it's such a rich piece of history to be able to. And I think there was the story where the tribe finds its way to the shores of a great sea, and divinity has slowed down the birds so that they can just pick them up to cook them and eat them. Right now, there is a species of migratory birds that flies over, I think, either the Mediterranean Sea or the Dead Sea, and by the time it finishes this hop of its migration, they're so exhausted that they just dive bomb onto the rock and they can't move. It's just like this long, you can imagine just like, you're driving through the longest leg of a road trip and you're just so tired, but you have to get to the other side of this mountain range on this lonely road, and the first exit on the other side, you're just like, there's just lines of cars where everybody passed out because everyone did the long haul drive. Yeah. So I think there's so much value there in history, both as history as a source of learning and a source of accumulated wisdom, and also so much there in terms of poetry that can inform the way we live our lives. To get back to actually answer your question, because I'm realizing every time you ask me a question, Andrea, I don't actually answer.
No,
I just sort of go on a tangent. So I'll answer this one. I'll answer this one, I promise.
Yes, okay.
So the best I've come up with, and in the absence of doing the Peterson thing, and I don't know that I certainly can't speak for the greater tribe of Sam Harris.
I know, we wouldn't want you to
4 Horsemen followers.
Speaking, yes, you're not their mouthpiece, you're your own, yes.
Yeah, but the closest I've come to is the notion that the afterlife is the memory of our consciousness after we're gone in the world. So Hitler's being punished because his name is well known and he is reviled as the most evil person that has ever lived, right? And until the last person spits his name out of their mouth, Hitler is in hell. And until the last person prays to Jesus, Jesus remains in heaven. And it's very similar. I was very irate. Have either of you seen the movie Coco?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it's Pixar.
So I was very irate when I heard about this movie because it was one of those things where I thought I had come up with something clever and inspiring.
The Day of the Dead, the Mexican Day of the Dead. Yeah.
Yeah. And then it turns out, this tradition that, this darn religious tradition already had this idea, and I just reinvented it and thought I was a clever new atheist. So, everything old is new again.
But as long as you remember your ancestors, they stay in the dead space of the good the good space, but then if you are forgotten, you go to the worst space of the afterlife. It's kind of heaven and hellish, but you have to be remembered. Yeah. Anyway.
Right. So my version of that is basically, so it serves a function in my personal psychology that I think is similar to to a justice afterlife. Now, it's still justice meted out in an imperfect way, right?
What if the dead are canceled, though? Like, Gandhi got canceled the other day.
Yeah. No, it's imperfect, and it's also not eternal, right? So part of this, there will be a last day that someone praises Jesus. There will be a last day that someone spits out the name Hitler, or there will be a day when Hitler is so far removed from the present generation that he's spoken of the way we speak of Genghis Khan now, right? Or Vlad the Impaler, right? Or any of those historical figures that were probably qualitatively, if not quantitatively, just as evil as Hitler. But we're just so far removed that they're sort of on a long enough time scale, everyone winds up in purgatory, maybe. But you go to, instead of being in purgatory and then going to heaven and hell, you start out in heaven or hell, and then you find your way to purgatory.
I see. With the neutral. Just the neutral.
When nobody curses your name anymore.
Yeah. Well, and and the sad part about this is that an eternity is way more compelling than an extra 20% of your normal lifespan, right? Which is with my model, and to your point about the civil wars in Yugoslavia and that not having the eternity offshore compresses things. My model isn't as good, right? The vast majority of people get like an extra couple of years out of my model. They don't get an eternity. But
it's interesting that you made this model at all, though. That's what's interesting to me, though.
How so?
That is very interesting.
Okay, Paul, I want to hear why you think it's interesting.
So we always come at these things in a couple of different ways. We look at it from the pragmatic perspective, and we say, well, yeah, so secularity basically shortens up, takes off the extra space. That's going to impact. It was very interesting listening to your ideas about this. That sort of fascinates me. Modernity, and this is, to swing all the way back, and we have to land the plane at some point because I have a couple other things this afternoon. Okay. But we've been at this a while. I mean, I go long conversations, and this one is gone. But it's modernity. All of these different ways of thinking shapes the thoughts and limits the scope and the ideas that we can entertain, that we can foster, that we can promote. The demand, I think the demand of modernity isn't a bad one, in that if I think about, so I've been, I was raised in a Christian home. My father and mother, wonderful Christian people. Grandparents on both sides, wonderful Christian people. Gosh, haven't I, compared to so many people I've met, haven't I been just richly blessed by the way that the things that history has offered me? That's such a wonderful thing. I don't find it difficult. I don't find it difficult to believe that the sacrifices that I make for Christ today will be more than rewarded in an afterlife, which is, I've been watching A Good Place or Upload, some of these popular Afterlife things. Oh, well, maybe we'll be uploaded into a computer, blah, blah, blah. They're very interesting programs because all of these programs run into, I think, the very honest realization that our capacity to imagine an interesting and satisfactory, uber satisfactory eternity is limited, and we just can't do it. But of course, a conscious, not a conscious being, this gets theological very quickly, but what Christians believe God to be, which would be not only the source of this dramatically beautiful, sometimes tortured, astoundingly complex universe that we get to participate in, would have the capacity to do it again, building on the winds of this world.
Wait.
That's a really hopeful thought. And the fact that by virtue of 3 generations, I don't find it difficult to emotionally inhabit that hope. And this would lead me to, sometimes in easy and other times in difficult moments, to say, I can sacrifice my welfare for this undeserving person because of this entire story that I live within and that has been built into me for successive generations.
Wait, are you saying that you agree? Like that you actually don't necessarily disagree with what Ryan is saying?
I can very much see it from a pragmatic point of view, that it would be that a society that can harbor such a thing, in fact, would be for the welfare of society, that we would have people compromise and sacrifice for their enemies and do things that would promote less violence and more justice and a better place, because all of us want our neighbors to live like that. All of us want our neighbors to be tremendously sacrificial and giving and generous, and that's the neighborhood we want to live in. And so if that's the neighborhood we want to live in, well, then we should probably embody that with our neighbors. But to essentially say that there's a hard stop at the point of my biological cessation is a letdown. And there's another letdown to say, well, maybe, science and technology will allow me to upload, but now Afterlife brought by Verizon, and I hope I made enough money in this world to get, a better upgrade in the life to come. So I actually find I find myself tremendously appreciative of the sacrifices of my parents and grandparents to deliver to me a faith that hopefully not only enables me to be loving and sacrificial towards my neighbors, but also to do so in such a way that is emotionally satisfying, and hopefully will lead me to the point that if when I come to the point where I'm laying on my deathbed, will appreciate the comfort of thinking about the fact that the best is yet to come, even though my body is worn out. What a wonderful, wonderful way to live. And it's for that reason that, whereas I have in many times wrestled with the tremendously challenging and sometimes very compelling vision that materialism or physicalism has to offer in terms of, well, look at all of these reasons why you're thinking this, and might this not simply be because this is how successive levels of evolution and society and sociology has delivered to you? And yeah, I can deal with that. And so maybe all of this is a fiction that is making you think that way. Okay, I can understand that too, but boy, am I sure glad I believe in this fiction. And in fact, I want my neighbors to believe it too. Or
at least act like they do.
Or at least act like they do.
Oh, we're going to end on a very Petersonian note.
Yeah. So for me, I look at, I talk with people who don't share my beliefs all the time, and I continue to feel deeply grateful and committed to my beliefs because I look at the alternatives, and I think I'll stick with what I got. I like it, and I think it serves the world. And my profession is encouraging others to think like I do. And so, and if they don't, I can be generous and patient towards them too, because that's also a package. That's also an asset of my belief system. So, yeah, that's sort of where I come down. But I appreciate the fact when people say, "Hey, I was raised in this way, and I believe these things, and I can't imagine myself believing any other way." I take them at their word.
And that's what this is all for, discussing things and taking something from the other person that we didn't have before. I think we did that, right, guys?
Yeah, it's been a blast.
It's been great.
I think this is a 2 hours and 20 minutes in.
Wow.
Solve the world's problems.
Maybe not quite that good.
Well, a few.
So some of the world's
some of
problems.
them a little chipping.
So a tiny bit of the world's problems every day.
Right. We'll end on that.
I think there will be a few hundred or maybe even a few thousand people who watch this video, and we will have given them, just in this short little bit of time, a little bit more hope, maybe a little capacity for generosity, maybe, yeah. And so I'm very happy with that.
Yay.
So thank you.
Yes.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for bearing with me with the technical issues, and then continue on.
I hope you haven't lost it.
I am gonna look at it right now. So we'll see.